Lonely mountain man went hunting for meat, but brought home a fat virgin instead. High in the frozen Colorado wilds, a rugged trapper sets out with one thought: find food or die trying. But when he stumbles through a snowstorm and finds a soft-spoken girl half buried in the drifts, everything changes. She's heavy, trembling, and alone, and when he carries her home, the fire that saves her life begins to thaw his own. She says she's never known a man, yet she's carrying a child she swears is a miracle. The law calls her mad. The townsfolk call him a sinner. But up on that mountain, between snow and silence, something sacred is stirring, something neither of them can explain. As the storm closes in, and the baby's cry echoes through the broken cabin. Did he rescue an innocent soul sent by God, or bring home a test of faith that will cost him everything? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The rifle shot echoed off the mountainside, swallowed quickly by the howling wind and thick curtain of snow. Joseph Warden's heart seized in his chest at the sound of the scream, high, feminine, and filled with terror. His hands trembled on his Winchester as he lowered the barrel. "Hello?" he called out, his deep voice carrying through the storm. "I mean no harm." The figure staggered between the snow-laden pines, more clearly human now. A woman, wrapped in what looked like a threadbare shawl, stumbled and fell to her knees in the deepening snow. Joseph's legs moved before his mind could catch up, crossing the distance in long strides, his snowshoes keeping him above the drifts. As he drew closer, the wind carried her sobbing to his ears. She tried to scramble backward at his approach, her movements clumsy with cold and fear. Up close, he could see she wore a dress wholly unsuited for mountain weather, her fingers blue where they clutched at her shawl. "Easy now," Joseph said, setting his rifle down in the snow and raising his empty hands. "I thought you were game. Didn't mean to frighten you." His voice came out rough from disuse. It had been weeks since he'd spoken to another soul. The woman's teeth chattered so hard she could barely form words. Please," she managed. "Help." Joseph shrugged out of his heavy wool coat without hesitation, though the bitter wind bit straight through his buckskin shirt. He draped it around her shoulders, noting how she flinched at his proximity. Her face was young, though lined with exhaustion, and her dark hair had frozen where it escaped her shawl. "Can you stand?" he asked, keeping his distance despite the urge to lift her from the snow. She nodded, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Joseph caught her before she could fall again, supporting her weight with one arm while retrieving his rifle with the other. The woman was light, too light, and shivering violently. "My cabin's half a mile north," he said. "Night's coming fast and this storm's getting worse. Will you let me help you there?" Her eyes, glassy with cold, searched his face. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her because she nodded again. "I can't feel my feet," she whispered. Joseph's jaw tightened. Frostbite was a deadly threat up here, and she wore only thin leather boots, now soaked through. Without another word, he scooped her into his arms. She weighed no more than a deer fawn, and he could feel her bones through the coat. The trek back to his cabin was slow and grueling. The wind drove ice crystals into his exposed face and neck, and his arms ached from carrying his unexpected burden. The woman had stopped shivering, a bad sign, and lay still against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. Joseph found himself muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years, asking God to keep her alive, to guide his feet home through the whiteout. The last rays of daylight were fading when he finally spotted the dark bulk of his cabin through the storm. He shouldered open the door, ducking through with his charge. The interior was cool. He'd been gone too long, but still held some warmth from the morning's fire. Joseph laid the woman gently on his narrow bed, then moved quickly to the hearth. His hands shook as he stacked kindling and struck flint to steel, willing the flames to catch. As warmth began to seep back into the single room, Joseph turned his attention to his unexpected guest. Her breathing had grown stronger, but her skin remained pale as new snow. He worked quickly but carefully to remove her wet boots and stockings, wrapping her feet in the warmest blanket he owned. The rest of her clothes were damp but not soaked through, and propriety kept him from doing more than loosely tucking the blanket around her. Joseph built up the fire until it roared, then set his last pot of water to heat. His stores were meager, a handful of dried beans, some salt pork, the dregs of his coffee. But he'd worry about that tomorrow. Tonight, keeping her alive was all that mattered. As he worked, questions crowded his mind. What was a woman doing alone in these mountains, in December, dressed for town rather than wilderness? Where had she come from? And what was she running from? For surely she was running from something. No one wandered these heights in winter without desperate cause. The woman stirred on the bed, her eyes fluttering open. They were brown, he noticed, dark as coffee grounds. Fear flickered across her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "You're safe," Joseph said quickly, keeping his distance by the fire. "We made it before the worst of the storm hit. Can you tell me your name?" She licked her cracked lips, voice barely above a whisper. "Martha." "Martha," he repeated. "I'm Joseph Warden. You're at my trapline cabin, about 20 miles from Silver Creek Settlement." He poured hot water into his cleanest cup, stirring in the last of his honey. "Think you can manage some of this? Need to warm you from the inside, too." Martha pushed herself up on shaking arms, accepting the cup with both hands. "Thank you," she murmured, sipping carefully. "I thought, when I heard the shot—" "I'm sorry about that," Joseph said, settling onto his three-legged stool. "Been tracking game all day, running low on meat. Thought you were a deer in the trees." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Don't mean to pry, but these mountains ain't kind to folks unprepared for them. How'd you come to be out there?" Martha's hands tightened on the cup, her gaze fixed on the fire. I had to leave. Quickly. Didn't think about where I was going, just had to get away." Her voice caught. "Didn't realize how far I'd walked until the snow started. Then I got turned around, couldn't find the road." Joseph nodded slowly, reading the fear beneath her words. He'd seen it before. Women fleeing bad husbands or worse situations, thinking the wilderness preferable to what they left behind. The mountains were rarely kinder. "Well," he said, rising to check his meager stores. "Storm's likely to keep us here a few days. You're welcome to stay until it passes and you're strong enough to travel." He didn't mention that his food wouldn't last that long. He'd figure something out. Maybe try setting snares near the cabin if the weather cleared enough. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be a burden. Once I can walk—" "You're no burden," Joseph cut in, more gruffly than he intended. "Can't turn anyone out in weather like this. Wouldn't be Christian." The word felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't thought of himself as particularly Christian since Sarah died. But something about this woman, lost and afraid in the wilderness, had awakened old instincts of protection and duty. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the cabin's shutters. Joseph added another log to the fire, watching Martha's eyes grow heavy as warmth and exhaustion took their toll. He spread his bedroll on the floor near the hearth, close enough to tend the fire through the night. "Rest," he told her. "You're safe here." As Martha drifted to sleep, Joseph sat in the firelight, listening to the storm rage. His belly was empty, his woodpile low, and tomorrow's problems loomed large as mountains. But for now, he had given shelter to someone in need, and that felt like enough. Perhaps, he thought, this was the answer to his earlier prayers, not the game he'd sought, but a chance to help another soul lost in the wilderness. The fire popped and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Joseph closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, found himself truly praying, not for meat or wood or survival, but for guidance in protecting the stranger Providence had placed in his care. Joseph pushed through waist-deep snow, his legs burning with effort. The wind howled between the pines, driving needles of ice into his face. He'd lost the trail completely now, following only his instincts and the occasional glimpse of the ridgeline through the whiteout conditions. The woman's scream still echoed in his mind, spurring him forward despite his exhaustion. A dark shape emerged through the curtain of white, a massive pine trunk, its branches laden with snow. There, crumpled at its base, lay a bundle of sodden fabric. Joseph's heart clenched as he approached. A woman lay half-buried in the drift, her calico dress woefully inadequate against the mountain cold. Her face was round and youthful, but her lips had taken on a dangerous bluish tinge. "Ma'am." He knelt beside her, brushing snow from her shoulders. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing glazed brown eyes. Her breath came in shallow gasps, forming weak clouds in the freezing air. "Name's Joseph Warden," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're near frozen. What's your name?"
Martha,"
she managed through chattering teeth. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the wind. Joseph didn't waste time on more questions. She had minutes at most in this cold, and the storm was worsening. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo robe and wrapped it around her shivering form, tucking the edges tight. The bite of the wind cut straight through his wool coat, but he ignored it. The woman needed the warmth more than he did. "I'm getting you somewhere safe," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could still hear him. Her eyes had drifted closed again. Moving carefully but quickly, Joseph lifted her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. She was heavier than he'd expected, but his years of hauling game had given him strength enough for this burden. The journey back to his cabin became a nightmare blur of white. The fresh snow had erased his earlier tracks, and the familiar landmarks had vanished in the storm. Joseph relied on his years of experience in these mountains, reading the slope of the land and the lay of the trees even when he could barely see 10 feet ahead. Each step was a battle against the drifts and the screaming wind. Hours passed. The temperature dropped further as night fell, and Joseph's muscles screamed in protest. He'd been moving since dawn, first checking his empty traps, then hunting, and now this desperate rescue. But he couldn't stop. The woman's breathing had grown more labored, and her body had gone ominously still against his shoulder. "Stay with me, Martha," he muttered, though the wind tore the words away. "The Lord didn't let me find you just to lose you to this storm." It was nearly midnight when Joseph finally spotted the dark bulk of his cabin through the swirling snow. His legs were numb, his shoulders on fire, but relief gave him a last surge of strength. He staggered the final yards to his door and kicked it open, ducking through with his precious cargo. The cabin was cold and dark, the fire having died hours ago. Joseph gently laid Martha near the hearth, then fumbled to light his oil lamp with shaking fingers. In its warm glow, he could see how dire her condition was. Her skin was pale as milk, her breathing shallow and irregular. Working quickly, Joseph built up the fire, his cold, numbed hands clumsy with the flint and steel. Once flames caught in the tinder, he added kindling and then larger logs until the fire roared. He positioned Martha closer to the warmth, careful to keep her far enough away to prevent shock from too rapid heating. From his meager stores, Joseph retrieved a pot and his last precious handful of dried beef. He set water to boil, then rummaged in the back of his cabinet for the emergency flask of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. While the broth simmered, he gently patted Martha's cheeks, trying to rouse her. "Martha, can you hear me? Need you to wake up now." Her eyelids fluttered, and a soft moan escaped her blue-tinged lips. Joseph propped her head up with his rolled jacket and held the whiskey flask to her mouth. "Just a sip," he urged. "Need to warm you from the inside." She coughed at the burn of the liquor but swallowed. A hint of color returned to her cheeks. Joseph turned to check the broth, adding a pinch of precious salt before pouring it into his cleanest tin cup. He helped Martha sit up slightly, supporting her with one arm while he held the cup to her lips with his other hand. "Small sips," he instructed. "Too much at once will make you sick." Martha managed a few swallows of the warm broth before her eyes focused properly on his face. "I didn't mean to trouble you, sir," she whispered, her voice rough. "I only meant to hide." Joseph's brow furrowed at her words. Hiding out here in December with no proper gear or supplies? She must have been desperate indeed. But now wasn't the time for questions. "No trouble?" he said gruffly, offering another sip of broth. "Couldn't leave you out there. Storm's the worst I've seen this season." As if in agreement, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, rattling the shutters. Martha flinched at the sound, then tried to sit up straighter. "I should go," she said, though she could barely hold herself upright. "I've imposed enough." "You're not going anywhere tonight," Joseph cut in firmly. "Or tomorrow, likely. Storm's got us trapped here for at least a day or two." He helped her take another sip of broth. "Whatever you're running from, it'll have to wait until you're stronger and the weather breaks." Tears welled in Martha's eyes, but she nodded. Joseph pretended not to notice them, busying himself with adding another log to the fire. The warmth was finally reaching the cabin's corners, and Martha's shivering had lessened. "Think you can manage the rest of this?" he asked, offering her the cup of broth. When she nodded, he left her propped against his jacket and moved to the cabin's single window. Through gaps in the shutters, he could see nothing but white fury. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Joseph's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since morning. His food stores were already dangerously low. He'd been counting on today's hunt to replenish them. Now he had 2 mouths to feed, and no way to reach his traps until the storm passed. But as he glanced back at Martha, huddled in his buffalo robe and sipping carefully at the broth, he couldn't regret his choice. Some things were more important than a full belly. Moving quietly, Joseph arranged his bedroll near the hearth where he could tend the fire through the night. Martha's eyes were growing heavy, the warmth and broth doing their work. "Sleep if you can," he told her. "You're safe here." She murmured something that might have been "thank you" before her eyes drifted closed. Joseph settled onto his bedroll, his own exhaustion catching up with him. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside his cabin there was warmth, shelter, and 2 souls brought together by providence or chance. He wasn't sure which. His last thought before sleep claimed him was a prayer of thanks that he'd found her in time, though his stores were empty, and tomorrow's challenges loomed large as the mountains themselves. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had grown stronger overnight, its howls echoing down the cabin's stone chimney like a pack of hungry wolves. Joseph stirred from his bedroll, muscles aching from yesterday's long carry through the snow. The fire had burned low during the night, and the cabin's chill bit at his bones as he added fresh logs. Near the hearth, Martha lay bundled in his buffalo robe and the 2 worn quilts he'd scrounged from his trunk. Her face was less pale than the night before, but her breathing still sounded labored. As he moved about the cabin, checking his gear and retrieving his trap repair kit, her eyes fluttered open. "Good morning, Mr. Warden," she whispered, her voice rough from the cold. She tried to push herself upright, but her arms trembled with the effort. Joseph watched from the corner of his eye as she struggled, his hands working methodically on a damaged trap spring. "Should rest," he said gruffly, not looking up from his work. "Storm's got us trapped here anyway." Martha managed to prop herself against the wall, though the effort left her breathing hard. The quilts slipped from her shoulders, and she hurriedly pulled them tight again, her cheeks flushing. "I'm sorry to be such a burden," she said softly. "I know it couldn't have been easy, carrying someone of my size through the snow." Joseph's hand stilled on the trap. He looked up then, meeting her embarrassed gaze. "Weigh less than a moose," he said matter-of-factly. "Carried plenty of those." A startled laugh escaped her, though it turned into a cough. Joseph set aside his work and poured water from the kettle he'd kept warm by the fire. He brought it to her, along with the last of the dried meat he'd used for last night's broth. "Need to eat," he said, settling the items within her reach. "Get your strength back." Martha accepted the water gratefully, but hesitated at the sight of the meat. "You've already shared so much of your stores," she protested. "I can't take your last provisions." Joseph shrugged, returning to his trap repair. "Storm breaks, I'll hunt more." He didn't mention how the empty traps and bare game trails had worried him these past weeks. That was his burden to bear, not hers. They sat in companionable silence for a time, Martha sipping her water while Joseph worked. The wind rattled the shutters, and occasionally a particularly strong gust would send snow hissing down the chimney to sizzle in the flames. Finally, Martha spoke again, her voice stronger. "I suppose you're wondering what brought me up here, so ill-prepared." Joseph said nothing, but his hands slowed on the trap spring, listening. "My father—" She twisted the tin cup between her fingers. "He arranged a marriage for me, to Ezekiel Morton, a farmer from over Silverton Way. He's 30 years my senior and—" She swallowed hard. "He's known for being cruel to his horses, to his first wife, too, before she passed." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on his work. "Father wouldn't listen when I begged him to reconsider. Said I should be grateful anyone would have me being—" She gestured at herself, shame coloring her words. "Being as I am. Said I was lucky Mr. Morton was willing to take damaged goods." The trap spring snapped suddenly in Joseph's hands. Martha jumped at the sharp sound. "Your father's wrong," Joseph said, his voice low and fierce. He set the broken trap aside and stood, moving to add more wood to the fire. He stacked extra logs near Martha's cot, within easy reach. "Thank you," she whispered, watching him work. "For everything." Joseph grunted in acknowledgement, retreating to his workbench. The day wore on, marked by the steady howl of wind and the quiet sounds of Joseph's work on his traps. He heated more water for broth, adding the last pinches of dried vegetables he'd been saving. Martha dozed on and off, her body still recovering from its ordeal. As evening approached, Joseph prepared a thin stew from the remaining meat and roots. They ate in silence, but it was a comfortable one. Martha's color had improved, and she managed to finish her portion without assistance. Night fell early, as it always did in December. Joseph banked the fire to last through the dark hours and settled onto his bedroll. The wind had grown stronger, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He could see Martha shivering despite her quilts. In the darkness, Joseph's lips moved in silent prayer, words he hadn't spoken aloud since Sarah died. Lord, watch over her soul, guide her path, keep her safe. The familiar ache in his chest tightened as memories of his wife surfaced. Mr. Warden. Martha's voice was soft in the darkness. Were you praying? No, he said quickly, too quickly, then softer. Get some sleep. A particularly violent gust rattled the entire cabin. Martha flinched, pulling the quilts tighter. Joseph watched her shiver for a moment before rising. Without a word, he moved her cot closer to the hearth, adjusting it so she could benefit from more of the fire's warmth. Thank you, she said again, and this time there was a faint smile in her voice. You know, Mr. Warden, you went out hunting for meat yesterday. She paused, and even in the dim firelight, he could see the gentle humor in her eyes. Seems the Lord sent you a woman instead. Joseph stood very still, struck by her words. Finally, he managed a gruff. Reckon he did at that. He returned to his bedroll, but sleep was slow in coming. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the storm and Martha's steady breathing, wondering at the mysterious ways the Lord worked. His larder might be empty, but somehow his cabin felt fuller than it had in years. Outside, the blizzard intensified, but inside, two souls found shelter from more than just the storm. Joseph's last conscious thought was that maybe Sarah's death hadn't been God abandoning him after all. Maybe it had been preparing him for this moment, when another lost soul would need the strength he'd gained from his own grief. 3 days passed, like molasses in winter. The storm raged outside, but inside Joseph's cabin, a quiet routine emerged. Each morning, Joseph would stoke the fire and check his dwindling supplies, while Martha recovered her strength. By the 3rd day, color had returned to her cheeks, and she could move about the cabin without getting winded. That afternoon, as weak sunlight finally broke through the clouds, Martha sat near the window, watching Joseph sort through his gear, her eyes fixed on his shirts, piled in a corner, torn from months of hard wear. Mr. Warden, she said, folding her hands in her lap, would you allow me to mend those shirts? It's the least I can do to repay your kindness. Joseph glanced up from his work, studying her face. No need to repay anything. Please, she insisted gently. I'm quite skilled with a needle. My father… She paused, swallowing hard. Well, he always said if I had any worth at all, it was in my sewing. Joseph's jaw tightened at her words, but he nodded. Needle and thread in that box by the hearth, he said gruffly, gesturing with his chin. Martha retrieved the sewing supplies and settled back in her spot near the window. The afternoon light, though dim, was enough to work by. She hummed softly as she stitched, an old hymn that tickled at Joseph's memory. As she shifted to thread her needle again, something small and dark slipped from a hidden pocket in her dress hem. It hit the plank floor with a soft thud. Joseph reached for it before she could move. It was a book, no bigger than his palm, bound in worn leather and carefully wrapped in oilcloth. A Bible, he realized, sewn secretly into her dress. He went to hand it back, but found himself opening the cover instead. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. There, in familiar, spidery handwriting, was a signature he hadn't seen in years. Preacher Amos Warden, by God's grace. Joseph's hands trembled. Where did you get this? His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Martha set aside her sewing, concern crossing her face. It was my uncle's. Preacher Amos Warden. She studied his reaction carefully. He baptized me when I was born, before he took up circuit preaching in the mining camps. Did you know him?" Joseph sank heavily onto a nearby stool, still staring at the signature. "He was my brother." The cabin fell silent, except for the crack and pop of the fire. Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Your brother?" But then, her eyes widened with recognition. The stories he used to tell about his quiet brother Joseph, who trapped in the high country. "That was you?" Joseph nodded, unable to speak. His finger traced the signature, remembering Amos's laugh, his passionate sermons about grace that could reach even the hardest heart. "He died," Joseph said finally, his voice rough. 5 years back. Mining camp revival in Silverton. Cave-in at the meeting house." "I know," Martha said softly. "Father received the telegram. He wouldn't let me attend the funeral. Said it wasn't proper for a girl my size to be seen in public mourning." She twisted her hands in her lap. "Uncle Amos was the only one who ever made me feel worthy, like God might love me just as I am." Joseph looked up sharply at that, seeing his brother's gentle heart echoed in her words. "Amos always said no soul was beyond God's reach," he said. "Even mine, after Sarah." He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Your wife?" Martha asked gently. Joseph nodded. "Died in childbirth. 7 years ago. Baby too." He hadn't spoken of it in so long, but somehow, here in the firelight with Amos's Bible between them, the words came easier. Had an old Ute midwife helping, Mrs. Redfeather. Did everything she could, but... He shook his head. Stopped believing after that. Couldn't see the grace Amos preached about anymore. Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the Bible's worn cover. "Uncle Amos used to say that grace isn't always gentle," she said finally. "Sometimes it comes like winter, harsh and cold at first, but carrying seeds of spring beneath the snow." Joseph's chest tightened at her words. They sounded so much like Amos, it was like hearing his brother's voice again. Outside, the wind had died down for the first time in days. The sudden quiet made the cabin feel intimate, almost sacred. Martha picked up her sewing again, but instead of humming, she began to speak softly about Amos, stories Joseph had never heard from when his brother would visit her family's farm. "He always brought me books," she said, smiling at the memory. "Said a mind needs feeding as much as a body. Father would burn them if he found them, but Uncle Amos taught me to hide them in clever places." She patted her dress hem. "Like this Bible." As evening settled in, Joseph found himself sharing his own memories of Amos. Hunting trips when they were boys, the day Amos announced he'd been called to preach, the last letter he'd received just days before the cave-in. "He wrote about mercy," Joseph said, stoking the fire. "Said he'd seen it work miracles in the mining camps, bitter enemies sharing bread, old feuds healed by simple kindness." He added another log. "Never did understand how he kept such faith in people." "Perhaps he saw what God sees," Martha suggested, shivering slightly in the evening chill. Without thinking, Joseph reached for his old wool blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She smiled her thanks, pulling it close. "You know, he used to pray for you, every night," he said, "that you'd find your way back to believing in grace." Joseph sat quiet, letting that sink in. Outside, wolves began their evening song, their howls echoing off the mountainsides. But inside the cabin, the space between him and Martha felt holy somehow, like those revival meetings Amos used to hold, only quieter, deeper. Martha picked up the Bible, opening it carefully. "Would you like to hear some of his favorite passages? He marked them all, see?" She pointed to small crosses inked in the margins. He said these were the ones that spoke clearest about God's love for broken people. Joseph nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. As Martha's soft voice filled the cabin with ancient words of hope, he found himself remembering how Amos used to read these same scriptures, bringing light to dark places. The wolves sang outside, but their howls couldn't touch the warmth within. Joseph's cabin, usually just a shelter from the elements, had become something more. Not grand like a proper church, but sacred in its own way. A place where grace could find its way in through the cracks, like sunshine after a storm. The winter sun hung pale in the Colorado sky as Martha regained her strength day by day. A week had passed since the discovery of Amos's Bible, and Joseph noticed how she moved with more sureness now, her cheeks carrying a healthier color. She had taken to tidying the cabin while he worked outside, making the rough-hewn space feel more like a home than it had in years. This morning, Joseph's axe bit deep into pine logs, the steady rhythm of his work carrying across the snow-covered yard. The growing woodpile testified to his labor. They'd need every stick to ward off the mountain cold. He paused to wipe his brow, the December air turning his breath to frost. Through the cabin's single window, he could see Martha kneeling beside her cot. Her lips moved in prayer, hands clasped tight. Something in her posture made him stop and watch. Her shoulders trembled, and though he couldn't make out the words, her voice carried a weight of desperate pleading that made his chest tighten. When evening came, they sat across from each other at his scarred table, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Martha barely touched her food, pushing it around her plate with restless movements. "Something troubling you?" Joseph asked, his gruff voice gentler than usual. Martha set down her fork, her hands twisting in her lap. "Mr. Warden, Joseph, there's something I need to tell you." She drew a deep breath. "Something you might find hard to believe." Joseph waited, noting how she wouldn't meet his eyes. She swallowed hard. "I'm with child." The words hung in the air between them. Joseph's first thought was of the man she'd fled from, anger rising hot in his throat. But Martha wasn't finished. "It's not what you're thinking," she said quickly. I'm still..." Color flooded her cheeks. "I'm a virgin, Mr. Warden." Joseph stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "That ain't possible," he said finally. "I know how it sounds." Martha's voice grew steadier, though her hands still trembled. "But 3 months ago, before I fled home, an angel appeared to me." Her eyes took on a distant look. "It was late evening. I was in the garden praying about the marriage Father had arranged. The air grew warm, like summer had returned, and there was light, brighter than the sun." Joseph shifted uncomfortably, recognition stirring in his memory. Amos had spoken of visions like this, of heaven breaking through to earth, but that had been his brother's faith, not his own. "The angel told me not to be afraid," Martha continued. "Said God had chosen me to bear a child who would bring peace to broken men." Her hand rested protectively over her middle. "A child of promise, meant to heal the wounds that keep hearts from believing." Joseph stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He paced the cabin's length, trying to make sense of her words. Part of him wanted to believe her. Her eyes held such clear conviction, unmarred by fear or guilt. But the practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive in these mountains, screamed that this was madness. "Martha," he said carefully, "sometimes when folks suffer bad things, their minds can..." He struggled to find gentle words. "Can create stories to help them bear it." "You think I'm crazy?" It wasn't a question. "Like they all did back home." Her voice held no anger, only sadness. "But I know what happened, Joseph. Just as surely as I know I'm sitting here now." Before he could respond, dogs barking outside drew his attention. Visitors were rare this high up, especially in winter. Joseph grabbed his rifle and cracked the door. 2 men on horseback approached through the gathering dusk. He recognized them as trappers who sometimes traded in town. Bill Rollins and his son Tom. They dismounted, stamping their boots in the snow. "Evening, Warden," Bill called. "Saw your smoke. Thought we'd warm ourselves a spell before heading on." Joseph nodded curtly, stepping aside to let them in. Martha had already moved to put coffee on, keeping her face turned away from the visitors. The trappers huddled near the fire, accepting cups with mumbled thanks. Tom's eyes kept straying to Martha, something knowing in his gaze that made Joseph's hand tighten on his rifle. "Quite a storm you had up here," Bill commented, blowing on his coffee. "Sheriff down in town's been asking after a woman might have passed through." He glanced at Martha. "Young thing," he said. "Ran off from her folks. Claimed some nonsense about angels and such." Joseph's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his face neutral, years of poker games serving him well. "That so?" Tom nodded eagerly. "Says she's not right in the head. Her father's offering a reward." He leaned forward. $20 to anyone brings her home safe." Martha's hands shook as she poured more coffee, but her voice stayed steady. "Sounds like quite a tale." "Sheriff's got papers on her," Bill added. "Anyone harboring her would be breaking the law." His eyes met Joseph's. "Just thought you ought to know, being so isolated up here. Never know who might come asking shelter." The threat in his words was clear as mountain air. Joseph fought the urge to put himself between Martha and the trapper's calculating gazes. "Much obliged for the warning," he said evenly, "but it's getting dark. You'll want to make the lower valley before full night." The trappers took the hint, finishing their coffee and heading back out into the cold. Joseph watched until their shapes disappeared into the gathering dark, then bolted the door. Martha stood by the fire, arms wrapped tight around herself. "I should go," she whispered. "I've brought trouble to your door." Joseph thought of the wanted papers in town, of his careful years of staying invisible to the law. Harboring her now would make him an outlaw. The very thing he'd avoided since Amos's death left him alone in the world. But then he remembered his brother's words about grace, about mercy being the truest measure of a man's faith. He thought of Amos baptizing Martha as a baby, claiming her for God's family. In a way, that made her Joseph's family too. "You'll stay," he said firmly. "Winter's too hard for traveling, especially in your condition." He checked the door's bolt again. "Besides, Amos would never forgive me if I turned you out." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "But what if they come back? What if—" "Then we'll face it," Joseph cut her off. "I don't know about angels or virgin births, but I know my brother believed in a God who worked miracles." He added wood to the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "Maybe it's time I remembered how to believe too." Martha sank into a chair, relief evident in every line of her body. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know this puts you at risk." Joseph nodded, his decision settling firm in his chest. Whether her story was truth or delusion didn't matter now. She was Amos's niece, carrying a child, miraculous or not, and she needed protection. His brother had died trying to bring God's light to dark places. The least Joseph could do was offer shelter to someone who carried that same light in her eyes. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing their tracks in clean white. Joseph knew the trappers would be back, probably with the sheriff. But for now, the cabin was warm and secure, a sanctuary for mysteries he couldn't explain but felt bound to protect. The February sun broke through clouds, warming the snow-laden branches until drops fell like rain. Joseph stood in his doorway, testing the snow's crust with his boot. The thaw wouldn't last long, maybe a day or two, but it made the trail passable enough to reach the old line shack 3 miles down. Their flour had run low, and he knew there'd be supplies cached there from last fall's hunting season. Martha appeared beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter. "The snow looks different today," she said, "like God's helping clear our path." Joseph grunted, but couldn't help noticing how the sunshine caught in her hair. She'd gained back some of her strength these past weeks, her cheeks pink with health despite their dwindling stores. "We'll take Jenny," he said, referring to his elderly mule. "She's steady on mountain trails even in slush." Martha nodded, already moving to help him prepare. She'd learned the rhythm of mountain life quickly, anticipating needs before he voiced them. As she packed a small sack with dried venison and cornbread, Joseph saddled Jenny, checking the cinch twice. The mule's breath steamed in the cold air as Joseph helped Martha mount. She settled sideways on the blanket he'd laid across Jenny's back, making room for him behind her. The trail down was treacherous with melting snow, but Jenny picked her way carefully, one sure hoof at a time. "My uncle used to say God made mules stubborn so they'd keep preachers humble," Martha said, breaking their comfortable silence. He claimed Jenny was the most theological creature he'd ever met. That startled a laugh from Joseph. "Amos would say that. He used to argue scripture with her when she got ornery." "Did she ever win?" "More often than not." Their shared memory of Amos hung warm between them as they descended. The line shack appeared around mid-morning, its snow-laden roof dark against the white slope. Joseph helped Martha down, steadying her when she swayed slightly. "You all right?" he asked, noting her pallor. She nodded, pressing a hand to her middle. "Just a bit dizzy. The baby sometimes makes me lightheaded." Joseph tried not to think too hard about her condition or its claimed origin. Instead, he focused on practical matters, breaking the simple lock on the shack's door. Inside, they found what he'd hoped for: 2 sacks of flour, some dried beans, and even a precious jar of honey someone had forgotten. "The Lord provides," Martha whispered, touching the supplies reverently. They loaded Jenny carefully, making sure the weight was balanced. The sun had risen high, melting more snow, making the trail slicker. Joseph insisted Martha ride while he led Jenny on foot. As they passed the switchback that offered a view of the town below, he caught sight of movement on the main street, several riders gathering near the sheriff's office. "Keep your head down," he murmured to Martha. "We're visible from below." She pulled her shawl forward, but it was too late. A glint of metal from a deputy's badge caught the sun. Joseph quickened their pace, knowing they'd been spotted. The rest of the climb passed in tense silence. By the time they reached the cabin, clouds had returned, and the wind carried the bite of approaching snow. Joseph hurried to unload Jenny and get Martha inside. "They'll come," he said, bolting the door. "That deputy will have recognized me even at a distance. They know where to look now." Martha's hands twisted in her skirts. "I'm so sorry, Joseph. I never meant to bring such trouble to your door." He shook his head, moving to the trunk where he kept his most precious possessions. From its depths, he pulled a carefully wrapped bundle, a soft wool shawl in deep blue, edged with careful embroidery. "This was Sarah's," he said quietly, holding out his wife's shawl. "She'd want you to have it. It's warmer than that thin one you're wearing." Martha touched the fabric with trembling fingers. "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will." He draped it around her shoulders, remembering how it had looked on Sarah. "But listen close. If strangers come while I'm out checking traps, you stay inside. Keep the door bolted. Don't answer any calls." She clutched the shawl closer, nodding. "What will you do?" "What needs doing?" He turned to the fireplace, not meeting her eyes. "I made a promise to protect you. Means I aim to keep you safe, no matter what the law says." Martha moved to the kitchen area, pulling out cornmeal and their precious honey. "Then we should eat well tonight. Build up our strength for whatever comes." They worked together in comfortable silence, Martha mixing cornbread while Joseph built up the fire. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the first flakes of new snow, the cabin filled with the warm smell of baking bread and wood smoke. Over their simple supper, Martha spoke of her childhood memories of Amos, making Joseph smile despite his worry. She described his habit of leaving Bible verses tucked into fence posts and hollow trees. So God's word could find folks even in the wilderness. When the last crumbs were cleared away, Martha knelt by her cot as she did each evening. But tonight, instead of her usual quiet murmur, she prayed aloud. "Lord, watch over Joseph Warden," she said clearly. "Guide his steps and guard his heart. Help him remember he's not alone anymore, not in this cabin, and not in your sight." Joseph sat very still in his chair, pretending to focus on cleaning his rifle. But his lips moved silently, adding his own prayer to hers. He hadn't prayed properly since Sarah died, but Martha's simple faith made it feel natural again, like picking up an old, familiar tool. The wind rattled the cabin's windows, and fresh snow scratched against the glass. Joseph added wood to the fire, watching Martha settle onto her cot, Sarah's shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. She looked right somehow, wearing it, like the cabin had been waiting for her presence all these lonely years. "Sleep well," he said gruffly, banking the fire for the night. "Tomorrow we'll need to be ready." "We will be," Martha answered softly. "God didn't lead me here just to abandon us now." Joseph climbed to his loft, listening to her breathing even out into sleep. Outside, the storm grew stronger, but inside, the cabin felt solid and warm, a fortress against more than just the weather. Whatever came with the law, he would face it. Amos had died bringing God's light to dark places. The least Joseph could do was shelter that light when it sought refuge at his door. 2 days after their trip to the line shack, Joseph woke before dawn to check his trap line. The morning air bit sharp and clean, stars still bright in the black sky. He'd barely reached the first trap when he heard it, the distant thunder of hoofbeats on frozen ground, coming up the mountain trail. His heart jumped. They'd come sooner than he'd expected. Joseph abandoned the trap line and rushed back to the cabin, his boots crunching through crusty snow. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of 2 riders making their way up the switchbacks. The morning sun glinted off something metal, a badge, maybe, or the barrel of a gun. Martha stood at the cabin window, her face pale but composed. She wore Sarah's blue shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her Bible clutched to her chest. "They've come for me," she said quietly. Joseph checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "Stay inside unless I call you." "I won't hide anymore," Martha replied. "Not from men, and not from truth." Before he could argue, the riders emerged from the tree line. Joseph recognized Deputy Calvin Hobbs, barely more than a boy, really, looking uncomfortable in his heavy coat. Beside him rode an older man Joseph didn't know, straight-backed on a big bay horse, wearing a black coat and a stern expression that spoke of authority. Joseph stepped out onto the cabin's small porch, rifle held loose but ready in his hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow as the riders approached. "Morning, gentlemen," he called, keeping his voice neutral. "Long ride up from town." The older man reined his horse to a stop, snow spraying from its hooves. "Are you Joseph Warden?" "I am. I'm Circuit Judge Luther Bramwell." The man's voice carried the weight of law and custom. This is my jurisdiction, Mr. Warden, and I have reports of a disturbed young woman being held at this location. Joseph's grip tightened on his rifle. Nobody's being held here, Your Honor. Miss Granger is under my protection, nothing more. Her father has sworn out a fight. Complaint, the judge continued, producing a paper from his coat. Claims she's suffered delusions, become dangerous to herself and others. He's requested she be remanded to proper care. Proper care? Joseph couldn't keep the edge from his voice. You mean locked away somewhere? Deputy Hobbs shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Warden, we're just trying to... The cabin door creaked open behind Joseph. Martha stepped out, her head held high despite the tremor in her hands. The blue shawl caught the morning light, making her look almost regal. Good morning, Your Honor, she said clearly. I'm Martha Granger. The deputy's eyes widened slightly. Whatever description they'd been given of a raving madwoman, Martha's calm dignity didn't match it. She stood straight and steady, meeting the judge's gaze without flinching. Judge Bramwell frowned. Miss Granger, your father is concerned for your welfare. He speaks of troubling behavior, dangerous claims. My father, Martha interrupted gently, is concerned for his reputation, Your Honor. Nothing more. Nevertheless, the law requires... The law? Joseph took a step forward, keeping his rifle pointed down but ready. What about God's law? What about protecting the innocent from those who'd cage them for speaking truth? The judge's face hardened. Mr. Warden, interfering with a legal warrant is a serious offense. So is standing by while injustice is done. Joseph planted his feet firmly. Miss Granger came to me half frozen, fleeing those who'd harm her. She's kin to my late brother, Preacher Amos Warden. She's shown nothing but grace and faith since arriving. Any man who calls her mad must answer to God first. Deputy Hobbs looked between Joseph and the judge, then spoke hesitantly. Your Honor, if I may, we could delay until spring thaw. The trail's dangerous now anyway, and Mr. Warden seems capable of providing care. Judge Bramwell's mouth tightened, but he studied Martha again. She stood quietly in the morning light, one hand resting protectively over her middle, the other still holding her Bible. There was something in her presence that made accusations of madness seem hollow. Miss Granger, the judge said finally, are you here of your own free will? I am, Your Honor. Martha's voice carried clearly in the cold air. God led me to this mountain, to this man's protection. I know how my claims must sound to earthly ears, but I speak only truth. The judge was silent for a long moment, snow falling softly around them all. Finally, he turned to Deputy Hobbs. You may have a point about the weather, Deputy. The trail will only get worse as winter deepens. Relief flickered across the young deputy's face. Yes, sir. Much safer to wait for spring. Until April, then. Judge Bramwell fixed Joseph with a stern look. But understand this, Mr. Warden. You're responsible for her welfare. Any harm comes to her, any trouble reaches town, and I'll return with more than just a deputy. Joseph nodded once, sharply. She'll be safe here. You have my word. The judge gathered his reins, turning his horse. Come April, we'll revisit this matter. Deputy? Young Hobbs touched his hat brim to Martha and Joseph. Ma'am, sir. Something like admiration showed in his eyes as he looked at Joseph's steady stance. Then he turned his horse to follow the judge. They watched the riders disappear down the trail, hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Only when they were completely gone did Martha's composure break. She began to weep, quiet tears of relief and gratitude rolling down her cheeks. Joseph awkwardly patted her shoulder. There now, it's all right. They're gone. You defended me, she whispered. You risked everything to protect me. "Weren't nothing else to do," he said gruffly. "Man's got to stand for what's right." Martha wiped her eyes with Sarah's shawl. "My uncle always said God works in mysterious ways. He sends angels in unexpected forms." Joseph shifted uncomfortably. "I'm no angel, Miss Granger. Just a man trying to do what's proper." She smiled through her tears. "Perhaps that's what angels really are, Mr. Warden. Just souls doing what's right when it matters most." The morning sun had risen fully now, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Joseph guided Martha back inside, where the fireplace still held warm coals. As he built up the fire, he found himself humming one of Amos's old hymns under his breath. Martha joined in softly, her voice still trembling slightly. The cabin felt different somehow, no longer just a shelter against wilderness, but a sanctuary. Joseph watched Martha move about, straightening things with familiar ease, and realized how completely his solitary life had changed. The law would return in spring, but for now, they were safe. For now, this small space held all the peace either of them needed. "I'll need to check those traps," he said finally. "You'll be all right here?" Martha nodded, already reaching for the cornmeal to start breakfast. "I'll be fine. God sent me a protector, after all." Joseph ducked his head, embarrassed by her faith in him. But as he stepped out into the bright morning, rifle on his shoulder, he felt lighter somehow. The mountain air seemed clearer, the day more promising. Perhaps Amos had been right all along. Sometimes God's greatest gifts came disguised as burden or trial. He looked back once at the cabin, smoke rising straight and true from its chimney. Martha stood in the window, Sarah's blue shawl bright against the dark interior. She lifted her hand in farewell, and Joseph found himself smiling as he turned toward his trapline. December 24th dawned clear and still over the San Juan Mountains. The usual wind had settled into hushed reverence, leaving the snow-laden pines standing like white-robed sentinels against the pale morning sky. Inside Joseph Warden's cabin, Martha hummed softly as she swept the rough-hewn floor, pausing now and then to rest one hand on her growing middle. Joseph had left before sunrise to check his trap line, giving Martha time to prepare her surprise. She'd been saving scraps of ribbon from her mending work, bits of faded red from an old petticoat, blue strips from Sarah's shawl's worn edges, and even a length of yellowed lace she'd found tucked in an old trunk. Now she gathered these treasures, along with some dried berries she'd strung together, and looked at the small pine branch she'd brought in yesterday. The branch sat in a tin can filled with melted snow on the table, its fresh scent filling the cabin. Martha touched one green needle gently. "It ain't much of a Christmas tree," she murmured to herself, "but the Lord made it beautiful all the same." She began decorating the branch, carefully tying the scraps of fabric into small bows. Each one she placed with deliberate care, stepping back to study the effect before adding the next. The berries she draped in graceful loops between the ribbons, their deep red standing out against the dark green needles. The cabin door creaked open, bringing a rush of cold air and Joseph's massive frame. He stamped snow from his boots, then paused, taking in the transformed pine branch. Martha held her breath, suddenly uncertain. "I hope you don't mind," she said quietly. "I just thought, well, it being Christmas Eve and all." Joseph set his rifle by the door and hung his snow-crusted coat on its peg. "No, I don't mind." His voice was gruff but gentle. "Looks right nice, actually. Been a long spell since this cabin saw any Christmas fixing." Martha beamed, relief washing through her. "I saved some rabbit meat from yesterday. Thought I might make a proper Christmas Eve stew, if you're agreeable." He nodded, moving to the fireplace where he began adding logs. "Sounds fine. Found 2 rabbits in the traps today. We won't go hungry tomorrow neither." While Martha busied herself with the cooking, Joseph settled at the table with his whittling knife and a piece of wood he'd been working on in secret moments. Martha noticed how he kept his broad shoulders hunched to hide whatever it was, but she didn't pry. Instead, she hummed Christmas hymns as she worked, the familiar tunes filling the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. The stew bubbled slowly, spreading savory scents of herbs and meat. Martha had added the last of their dried carrots and some precious salt, making it as special as she could manage. Outside, the short winter day was already fading, though it was barely past 4 o'clock. Joseph lit the oil lamp, its gentle glow catching the ribbons on the pine branch and making them shimmer. "Almost ready," Martha announced, stirring the pot one final time. She ladled the stew into their tin bowls, adding an extra portion to Joseph's. He worked hard, and though he never complained, she knew the winter hunting took its toll. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the occasional scrape of spoons against tin. Martha saved a piece of her cornbread, wrapping it carefully in a clean cloth. "For tomorrow's breakfast," she explained when Joseph raised an eyebrow. "Got to have something special for Christmas morning." After the bowls were cleaned and put away, Joseph cleared his throat. "Got something for you," he said awkwardly, reaching into his shirt pocket. "Ain't much, but—" He held out his hand, something small gleaming in his palm. Martha took it carefully. In the lamplight, she saw it was a wooden locket, lovingly carved and polished smooth. On its face, Joseph had painstakingly engraved the initials S.W., Sarah Warden, his late wife's name. "Joseph," Martha's voice caught in her throat. "Thought maybe you could wear it," he said quickly, as if afraid she'd refuse. "To remind you you're safe here, that you got a home long as you need one." Martha ran her finger over the initials, feeling each carefully carved line. Sarah's initials. She would have wanted someone good to have it, Joseph said softly. Someone who understood about faith and such. Been keeping her things in that trunk too long, letting memories gather dust instead of doing good. Tears welled in Martha's eyes as she clutched the locket. "It reminds me God hasn't forgotten either of us," she whispered. "How he brings healing in the most unexpected ways." Joseph shifted in his chair, emotion playing across his usually stoic features. "Been thinking on that some," he admitted. "About God's hand in things. How you showing up weren't no accident, maybe." Martha smiled through her tears. "Would you pray with me, Joseph? It being Christmas Eve and all?" For a moment he looked startled, almost afraid. Then, slowly, he nodded. Together they knelt beside the fireplace, the pine branch's shadow dancing on the wall behind them. Martha bowed her head, waiting. Joseph cleared his throat. "Lord." His voice cracked, thick with emotion he'd held back for years. "Lord, it's been a spell since I talked proper to you. Been angry, I reckon, since you took her home." He paused, struggling. "But maybe I was wrong, thinking you'd abandoned me up here. Maybe you was just waiting for the right time to send—" He glanced at Martha, then continued, "to send hope back to my door." Martha's hand found his, squeezing gently. Joseph's fingers trembled but held on. "Thank you," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "For this food, this shelter, for bringing Martha here safe, for helping me remember what it feels like to trust in more than just myself." Martha added her own quiet, "Amen," then looked up to find tears tracking down Joseph's weathered cheeks. He wiped them away quickly with his free hand, but didn't pull away from her grip. They stayed like that for a long moment, the fire's warmth wrapping around them like a blanket. Outside, the crystal-clear mountain night had transformed the world into a glittering expanse of starlight on snow. The peaks stood black against a sky ablaze with more stars than Martha had ever seen, each one a diamond on midnight velvet. Inside, the lamp's flame cast a gentle glow over the humble cabin. The decorated pine branch, the swept floor, the two people kneeling in prayer. Martha's new locket caught the light, Sarah's initials gleaming like a blessing. The hope that filled the small space seemed brighter than any lantern could produce, warming them both from the inside out. Joseph finally stood, helping Martha to her feet with gentle courtesy. "Best get some rest," he said gruffly, though his eyes were softer than she'd ever seen them. "Night's going to be cold." Martha nodded, clutching her precious locket. "Thank you, Joseph. Not just for this, but for everything." He ducked his head in acknowledgement, then moved to bank the fire for the night. Martha made her way to her cot, which Joseph had never moved back from its place near the hearth. As she settled under her quilts, she watched him go through his nightly routine, checking the door latch, adjusting the lamp's wick, making sure everything was secure. The lamp went out, leaving only the fire's dim glow. Martha closed her eyes, still holding the locket close. In the darkness, she heard Joseph's heavy steps pause by her cot. "Merry Christmas, Martha," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it. "Merry Christmas, Joseph," she whispered back. The cabin settled into peaceful silence, broken only by the soft crackle of embers and the occasional settling of logs in the snow outside. Tomorrow would bring Christmas Day, but Martha knew they'd already received their greatest gifts: renewed faith, found family, and the warmth of hearts healing together under the vast Colorado sky. The February thaw came sudden and fierce, turning packed snow to treacherous slush. Water dripped from pine boughs, and icicles shrank to daggers above the cabin's door. The constant melt made everything damp: clothes, bedding, even the firewood Joseph had stacked carefully against the inner wall. Martha stood at the window, wiping condensation from the glass with her sleeve. The world outside looked half-formed, caught between winter and spring. Dirty snow slumped in piles, and the trail down to the valley had become a ribbon of brown muck. "Storm's coming," Joseph said from behind her. "Can smell it." She nodded, having learned to trust his weather sense. "The bread's almost done. Should I put more wood on?" Before Joseph could answer, a shout came from outside. Both of them tensed. Joseph reached for his rifle, but the voice called again, more clearly this time. "Hello, the cabin. Got a tired prospector seeking shelter?" Joseph moved to the door, rifle ready but pointed down. "Show yourself proper." A man trudged into view, leading a loaded mule. His clothes were soaked to the knee with mud, and his beard was shot through with gray. "Name's Tucker," he called. "Been working claims up Silver Creek. Trail's too mean to make town before dark." Joseph studied him a moment, then nodded curtly. "Come in then. But mind your manners. Got a lady present?" Tucker's eyebrows rose at the sight of Martha, but he touched his hat politely. "Ma'am, much obliged for the shelter." Martha busied herself setting out coffee and fresh bread, while Joseph helped Tucker settle his mule in the lean-to. The prospector's clothes steamed by the fire as he warmed himself, talking steadily of conditions up the creek and rumors from town. "Sheriff's been asking after folk living high up," Tucker mentioned, watching Martha from the corner of his eye. "Seems some preacher's girl went missing around Christmas time. Crazy story going round about her being touched in the head, claiming angels spoke to her and such." Martha's hands trembled slightly as she poured more coffee. Joseph's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Tucker stayed through supper, sleeping on a bedroll near the door. He left at first light, tipping his hat and thanking them again. Joseph watched him go, expression dark. "He'll talk," he said finally. "Men like that live on gossip same as coffee." Martha's heart sank. "I'm sorry, Joseph. I never meant to bring trouble to your door." He shook his head. "Ain't your fault. People got mean tongues and empty lives. Makes them hungry for stories about others' business." His prediction proved true. Within days, riders began appearing on the ridge more frequently. They carried rifles and claimed to be hunting, but their eyes lingered too long on the cabin. Sometimes they called mocking questions about angels and virgins, their laughter echoing off the rocks. Joseph kept his rifle loaded and close. He taught Martha to watch the ridge while he checked his trap line, showing her which approaches to guard most carefully. She learned to spot movement among the trees, to tell the difference between a deer's cautious step and a man's deliberate tread. One evening, after another group of riders had passed by, Martha sat at the table, her hands twisted in her apron. "Maybe I should leave," she said quietly. "Find somewhere else to go. You had peace here before I came." Joseph looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Peace ain't worth much if it costs mercy," he said gruffly. "Besides, where would you go? Town's not safe for you now." "But your home—" "Ain't been much of a home since Sarah died," he interrupted. "Just a place to exist, having you here." He paused, struggling with the words. "Makes it feel more like living again." Martha blinked back tears, touching the locket she still wore. Before she could respond, thunder rolled across the valley. They both went to the window. Dark clouds were building over the peaks, heavy with snow despite the recent thaw. Lightning flickered in their depths. The wind picked up, carrying the first few flakes. "Bad one coming," Joseph said. "Might last days." They worked quickly to prepare, bringing in extra wood, checking the chimney draw, making sure the mule had fresh hay in the lean-to. By the time full darkness fell, snow was falling heavily. Wind howled around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and whisking in cold drafts. The storm forced them to stay close to the fire. Joseph pulled his chair near Martha's as they ate their supper of beans and salt pork. Neither spoke much, both aware of how the weather had trapped them together, yet uncertain what that meant. Martha darned socks by lamplight while Joseph whittled. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the storm raged, but inside was warm, almost peaceful, if not for the knowledge that somewhere out there, men with mean intentions waited for the weather to clear. "I've been thinking," Joseph said suddenly, setting down his knife. "About what comes after." Martha's hands stilled. "After?" "After the snow melts proper, after spring comes." He stared into the fire. "Can't keep living like this, watching the ridge, jumping at shadows. Ain't good for either of us." "No," Martha agreed softly. "It isn't." Thunder crashed overhead, making the cabin timbers creak. Joseph added another log to the fire, movements careful and measured. "Whatever comes," he said finally, "we'll face it together. I gave my word to protect you, and I mean to keep it." Martha touched her locket again, feeling the familiar initials under her fingers. "Thank you, Joseph, for everything." He nodded, apparently out of words. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged on, both aware that when it cleared, decisions would have to be made. But for now, in the warmth of the cabin, they had this moment of peace, however temporary it might prove to be. Snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white once more. The wind sang its wild song around the cabin walls, while inside, two people who had found unexpected sanctuary in each other's company waited to see what tomorrow would bring. The first hints of daybreak crept across the snow-laden peaks, painting the world in shades of pearl and shadow. Joseph stirred from his uneasy sleep near the fire, where he dozed sitting upright in his chair. Martha lay curled on her cot, wrapped in quilts, her breathing soft and steady. A deep rumble shook the ground. Joseph's eyes snapped open, his body tensing with instinct born from years in the mountains. The sound grew louder, a roar like 1,000 stampeding buffalo. "Martha!" he shouted, lunging toward her cot. "Wake up!" She blinked groggily, but before she could speak, the cabin's north wall exploded inward. Snow and timber crashed through in a deadly cascade, bringing with it the stink of wet earth and splintered pine. Joseph grabbed Martha, yanking her from the cot just as a massive beam crashed down where she'd been lying. "Hold on to me," he ordered, wrapping one arm around her waist. With his free hand, he seized his rifle and the buffalo robe from its peg. The cabin groaned around them, timbers splitting like gunshots. Joseph half-carried, half-dragged Martha toward the door, fighting against the tide of snow pouring through the broken wall. The floor buckled beneath their feet. They burst out into the howling storm. The wind cut through their clothes like knives of ice, and the snow fell so thick Joseph could barely see 3 feet ahead. Martha stumbled, her feet slipping on the treacherous ground. "I can't," she gasped, but Joseph wouldn't let her fall. "Just a little further," he urged, though he had no clear destination in mind. His only thought was to get away from the collapsing cabin before it buried them both. Through the curtain of snow, he spotted the rocky overhang where he sometimes cleaned his pelts. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He pulled Martha toward it, fighting against the wind that tried to tear them apart. They collapsed beneath the outcropping just as another avalanche thundered down the slope. The sound was deafening, drowning out even the howl of the wind. Joseph pressed Martha against the rock face, shielding her with his body as snow and debris roared past their shelter. For what seemed like hours, they huddled together, sharing what warmth they could. Joseph wrapped the buffalo robe around Martha, who shivered violently despite the covering. He held her close, remembering another storm years ago when he'd failed to protect someone he loved. Finally, the thunder of sliding snow faded. The wind died down to a whisper, and the heavy snowfall eased to scattered flakes. In the growing light, Joseph could see the devastation clearly for the first time. The cabin still stood, but barely. The entire north wall had collapsed inward, and the roof sagged dangerously. Snow filled half the interior like white sand in a broken bottle. Their tracks leading to the overhang were already filling with fresh powder. "We need to salvage what we can," Joseph said grimly, "before the rest comes down." Martha nodded, her face pale but determined. They picked their way carefully back to the wreckage. Inside, the destruction was even worse than it had looked from outside. The table lay smashed beneath fallen rafters. Their stores of flour and dried beans were soaked and ruined. The hearth still glowed faintly with embedded coals, but most of their firewood was buried under snow and debris. Joseph began pulling what he could from the wreckage: his powder horn, some rope, a few tins of coffee, his trapline tools. Martha gathered her Bible and what remained of their food supplies, working quickly despite her obvious exhaustion. Suddenly she gasped and doubled over, one hand clutching her swollen belly. The tin of coffee she'd been holding clattered to the floor. "Martha?" Joseph dropped the supplies and rushed to her side. "What's wrong?" "The baby," she whispered, face contorted in pain. "Something's not right. It's too soon." Terror gripped Joseph's heart like an icy fist. No, he thought. Not again. Not like Sarah. He could still remember his wife's face, pale and drawn with pain as she struggled to birth their child. Remember how both their lives had slipped away while he watched, helpless to save either of them. Martha cried out again, her legs buckling. Joseph caught her before she fell, lifting her as gently as he could. He carried her to the least damaged corner of the cabin, near the remnants of the hearth. Laying out his buffalo robe over a relatively dry patch of floor, he eased her down onto it. Just rest easy," he said, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "I'll build up the fire." He scrambled to gather unburied firewood, working frantically to rebuild the hearth's warmth. Martha's breathing came in sharp gasps that tore at his soul. When she whimpered in pain, he felt it like a physical blow. "Lord," he whispered, then louder, "Lord, don't take another woman from me." His voice cracked as he added more wood to the fire. "Please, I can't watch it happen again." Martha reached out and caught his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Joseph," she said between breaths, "God hasn't abandoned us. He led you to find me in the snow, led me to your brother's Bible. This isn't like before. This is different." "You don't understand," he said roughly. "I watched Sarah die. Couldn't do anything but watch. If something happens to you—" "Then pray with me," she insisted. "Not just for me, for yourself. For the faith you lost when Sarah died." Another contraction seized her, and she squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt. Joseph found himself on his knees beside her, words he thought he'd forgotten tumbling from his lips. "Our Father," he began, voice shaking. "I know I ain't been much of a believer these past years. Been angry at you, if I'm honest. But Martha, she believes. She's got faith enough for both of us. So if you're listening, if you ever listen to me at all, please don't take her too." Outside, the wind died completely. The sudden silence pressed against the broken cabin walls like a living thing. Martha's pain-filled gasps seemed to fill the whole world. Joseph held her hand and continued to pray, the words coming easier now, like water breaking through a long frozen stream. Snow began to fall again, drifting through the broken roof to dust their huddled forms with white. The hearth's embers cast dancing shadows on what remained of the walls. And in that strange, suspended moment between storm and silence, between faith and fear, Joseph Warden waited to see if God would answer his prayer. Through the endless night, Joseph knelt beside Martha on the cabin's broken floor. The familiar motions of preparing for birth came back to him like a nightmare he couldn't escape. His hands shook as he poured water into his largest pot and set it over the struggling fire. "Just breathe," he told her, though his own breath came ragged. "Like this." He demonstrated the quick, shallow pants he remembered the midwife teaching Sarah. Martha tried to follow his lead, but pain twisted her features. Her screams echoed off the remaining walls, making Joseph flinch with each cry. He tore his old shirts into strips, the sound of ripping fabric mixing with Martha's labored breathing. Snow drifted through the gaping hole in the roof, settling on Martha's sweating face like tiny stars. Joseph brushed them away with trembling fingers. The buffalo robe beneath her was soaked through, and the fire struggled against the bitter wind that swept through the damaged cabin. "Tell me about Sarah," Martha gasped between contractions. "Your wife. What was she like?" Joseph's throat tightened. "Strong," he managed. "Like you. She loved the mountains. Used to sing while she worked." He swallowed hard. "She was carrying our first child when—" Another scream cut through his words. Martha's back arched in agony, and Joseph grabbed her hand. Her fingers crushed his, but he welcomed the pain. It was better than feeling helpless. "The old Ute midwife," he continued, desperate to fill the terrible silence between Martha's cries. "She taught me some things, about herbs and such, but nothing helped Sarah in the end." Hours crawled by like wounded animals. The fire burned low, no matter how many precious logs Joseph added. Martha's strength began to fade, her screams becoming whimpers. Joseph found himself praying under his breath, fragments of scripture mixing with desperate pleas. Lord, if you're there, if you ever were. Snow and shadows danced across the cabin floor. Joseph's world narrowed to Martha's pain-filled face, the feel of her hand in his, the terrible waiting. He wiped her brow with the last clean cloth, remembering how Sarah had looked near the end, pale as mountain frost, lips blue with effort. "Joseph," Martha whispered, her voice hardly more than a breath. "Promise me." "Save your strength," he interrupted. He couldn't bear to hear last requests. Not again. The wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie stillness. Martha's final push ended in a gasp that seemed to empty her completely. Then silence fell, a silence so profound Joseph could hear the snow settling on the broken roof beams. In his hands lay a tiny, motionless form, perfect fingers, dark lashes, skin blue as twilight. Joseph wrapped the infant in his coat with shaking hands, but there was no flutter of breath, no cry of life. Martha's head fell back against the buffalo robe, her eyes closed, her chest barely moved. "No," Joseph whispered. "No, not again. Please, not again." He clutched the small bundle to his chest, rocking back and forth as tears began to fall. They traced hot paths down his frozen cheeks, dropping onto the coat that held such a precious, still weight. The first gray light of dawn crept through the broken wall. Joseph remained kneeling, his body curved protectively over the infant and Martha's still form. For the first time since Sarah's death, words of prayer poured from him like blood from a wound. "God," he sobbed, "I know I turned my back on you, blamed you for Sarah, hid myself away up here like a coward, but please, please don't punish Martha for my lack of faith. Don't take her too. I'll do anything. Just, please." His voice broke. Tears fell faster now, years of stored grief finally breaking free. He wept for Sarah, for their lost child, for all the lonely years he'd spent hiding from his pain. He wept for Martha's trust in him, for the tiny life in his arms that never had a chance to bloom. "I believe," he whispered hoarsely. "Help my unbelief. Please, have mercy." The rising sun sent pale fingers through the cabin's wounds. Snow continued to fall, gentle now, dusting Joseph's bowed shoulders like a benediction. He knelt there in the growing light, cradling his coat full of broken dreams, praying with everything left in his emptied heart. His throat was raw from crying, his knees numb from the hard floor. Still he prayed, the words tumbling out in a desperate stream. He bargained, pleaded, confessed every doubt and bitter thought he'd harbored since Sarah's death. The sun climbed higher, but Joseph remained lost in his anguished vigil, waiting for an answer he feared would never come. Morning light crept through the broken wall of the cabin, painting pale stripes across the dirt floor. Joseph's knees ached from the long night's vigil, but he couldn't bring himself to move. Martha lay still beneath the buffalo robe, her breathing shallow but steady. The tiny bundle in his coat hadn't stirred since birth. With stiff fingers, Joseph reached for his knife. Outside, young pines swayed in the dawn breeze. He would need to cut branches for a cross. The thought drove him to his feet at last, legs trembling from exhaustion. The weight of the small bundle pressed against his heart as he carried it to the table. Gently, so gently, he laid the infant down. His hands shook as he reached for his coat collar, meaning to free the rough wool for a proper wrapping. The cabin felt colder than ever, despite the struggling fire. Or maybe the chill came from within him, from the ice forming around his heart. "Lord," he whispered, voice cracking, "I don't understand your ways, but Sarah would have wanted He couldn't finish the thought. That's when he heard it. So faint he thought he'd imagined it. A sound like a kitten's mew. Joseph froze, hardly daring to breathe. There it came again, the tiniest whimper from within his coat. "Joseph?" Martha's weak voice drifted from her makeshift bed. "You hear it too?" His hands shook harder as he carefully unwrapped the bundle. The infant's skin had warmed from blue to pink. As he watched, unable to believe his eyes, tiny fingers flexed. A small chest rose and fell with unmistakable breath. Tears blurred his vision as he lifted the living child. "She's breathing," he choked out. "Martha, she's breathing!" Martha's arms reached weakly toward them. Joseph knelt beside her, laying the infant against her breast. The baby's head turned instinctively, seeking warmth. Martha's eyes filled with tears as she touched her daughter's cheek. "My angel was right," she whispered. "God had a plan all along." Joseph couldn't speak. He watched in wonder as the child's fingers curled around Martha's thumb. All night he'd relived Sarah's death. Certain history would repeat itself. Instead, he'd witnessed a miracle. "She needs a name," Martha said softly. Joseph touched the baby's dark hair. "Grace," he replied without hesitation, "because that's what she is. Pure grace." Martha smiled. "Grace it is then." She looked up at the hole in the roof where snow still drifted in. Though she might appreciate a proper roof over her head. Joseph squeezed Martha's hand, then stood with new purpose. The cabin's damage couldn't wait. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, where dawn painted the snow-covered peaks gold. His tools lay scattered from the landslide, but most were still usable. Working quickly, he gathered fallen timber from the slope. The wood was green, but it would have to do. He found enough intact boards from the broken wall to patch the worst gaps. The physical labor helped steady his hands, still trembling from the night's emotions. The sun climbed higher as he worked. Every few minutes he paused to check on Martha and Grace through the cabin's open door. Each time, the sight of them together made his heart swell. Martha dozed while Grace nursed, both peaceful despite the cold draft. By midday, Joseph had restored enough of the roof to keep out snow. He banked the fire higher, feeding it precious dry wood from his protected stack. Smoke rose straight and strong from the repaired chimney, a signal to the valley below that life continued on the mountain. Inside, he built a cradle from a wooden box, lining it with soft furs. Martha watched with tired eyes as he worked, humming an old hymn. The tune caught in his throat. He recognized it as one Sarah used to sing. "I think she would be happy," Martha said softly, reading his thoughts. "Sarah, I mean, happy that you found room in your heart to love again." Joseph sat beside them, touching Grace's tiny hand. "I spent so long angry at God for taking Sarah, couldn't see past my own grief to his bigger plan." He swallowed hard. "Bringing you here, giving us Grace, it's more than I deserve." "Love isn't about deserving," Martha replied. "It's about accepting the gift when it's offered." She smiled down at Grace. "Even when it comes in unexpected ways." Through the afternoon, Joseph continued making repairs. The physical work helped him process the emotional storm of the past day. Every hammer blow felt like a prayer of thanksgiving. Every board he secured was an act of faith in the future. As evening approached, he fixed a final beam in place. Smoke curled steadily from the chimney now, carrying the scent of pine and promise. Below in the valley, lights began to twinkle in distant cabins. But up here on his mountain, Joseph had found something brighter than any lantern. The light of grace, burning away years of darkness. He stepped back inside, stamping snow from his boots. Martha had managed to sit up, cradling Grace while she suckled. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Lamplight caught the tears on Martha's cheeks as she sang softly. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." Joseph's voice joined hers, rough but sincere. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Grace's tiny fingers flexed as if conducting their duet. Outside, stars emerged in the crystal mountain sky. Inside, the repaired cabin glowed with warmth and new life. Joseph added wood to the fire, sending a fresh spiral of smoke into the gathering dark. A signal of hope, of survival, of providence fulfilled. Martha's eyes met his across the cradle. No words were needed. They both understood the miracle they'd witnessed. Grace's tiny breaths, the smoke rising straight and strong, the light returning to Joseph's heart, all spoke of divine mercy and second chances. The night settled soft around the cabin. But unlike the darkness of grief that had shrouded Joseph for so long, this darkness felt like a gentle blessing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. For now, they simply watched their daughter sleep, grateful for every breath, every moment, every gift of grace. 2 weeks passed like a gentle stream over stones. Martha grew stronger each day, though she still tired easily. Grace thrived under their shared care, her tiny fingers reaching for Joseph's beard whenever he held her. The cabin, patched and sturdy once more, rang with the quiet music of their new family. Soft lullabies, whispered prayers, and the occasional squall of a healthy infant. Joseph sat in his old wooden chair beside Martha's bed, Grace bundled against his chest. His rough fingers traced the worn pages of Preacher Amos's Bible as he read aloud from Psalms. Martha listened with closed eyes, a peaceful smile on her face. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes like tiny stars. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats shattered their peace. Joseph's head snapped up. He passed Grace carefully to Martha, then moved to the window. 2 riders approached through the melting snow, familiar figures that made his heart sink. Judge Bramwell and Deputy Hobbs had returned. "Stay calm," he murmured to Martha. "Whatever happens, trust in the Lord." Martha clutched Grace closer, but her voice remained steady. "I do trust him. And you." Joseph stepped onto the porch, leaving the door open behind him. The riders dismounted, their boots crunching in the crusty snow. Deputy Hobbs hung back, his young face troubled. Judge Bramwell stepped forward, his stern features set in official lines. "Mr. Warden," the judge began formally, "we've come to assess—" He broke off as Grace's soft cooing drifted through the doorway. Something flickered in the judge's weathered face. "Please," Joseph said quietly. "Come inside and see for yourself." The cabin's warmth enveloped them as they entered. Martha sat propped against pillows, Grace nursing contentedly at her breast. The Bible lay open on Joseph's chair. Sunlight painted everything in gentle gold. Deputy Hobbs removed his hat, mouth slightly open as he stared at the peaceful scene. The judge remained in the doorway, his shadow long across the floor. Joseph returned to his chair, picking up the Bible. "We were just reading Psalms," he said. "Would you care to join us?" The judge's eyes fixed on Grace, something raw and painful crossing his expression. Joseph remembered what he'd heard in town, how Bramwell had lost his wife and infant son to pneumonia the previous winter. The man's hands trembled slightly at his sides. "The law requires—" the judge started, then faltered. "The law requires justice," Joseph said softly. "But sometimes justice means mercy." He met the judge's gaze. "You can take her if you must, but you'll answer to the Lord for it." Silence filled the cabin, broken only by Grace's contented sighs. Deputy Hobbs shifted uncomfortably, looking between the judge and the small family before him. Judge Bramwell's stern facade cracked. He removed his hat, revealing gray hair and eyes that suddenly seemed very tired. His gaze lingered on Grace, then moved to the Bible in Joseph's hands. "My Sarah," he said roughly. "She used to read that same book to our boy." He cleared his throat. "Before—" Martha's gentle voice filled the silence. "They're watching over us all, sir. Your Sarah, Joseph's Sarah, and all the little ones gone too soon. But God sends new blessings, if we're willing to see them." The judge's shoulders sagged, as if a great weight had settled on them. He turned to Deputy Hobbs. "There's nothing here requiring the law's attention." Relief washed over the young deputy's face. "No, sir, there surely ain't." Judge Bramwell looked back at Martha and Grace, then at Joseph. "Keep her," he said quietly. "Both of them. Raise her right." He jammed his hat back on his head, hiding his eyes. "That's all the law asks." Without another word, he strode out of the cabin. Deputy Hobbs lingered just long enough to touch his hat brim to Martha and give Joseph a respectful nod. The sound of hoofbeats faded down the mountain. Joseph closed the Bible and moved to sit on the edge of Martha's bed. Grace had fallen asleep, one tiny hand curled around her mother's finger. "Thank you, Lord," Martha whispered. Joseph touched Grace's downy head, marveling at how such a small life could soften such hardened hearts. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle as mercy itself. The mountain released winter's grip slowly, like a bear uncurling from long sleep. Patches of brown earth emerged between melting snow, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine sap and wet soil. Joseph rose early each morning, his axe ringing against fresh-cut logs as he strengthened the cabin's damaged walls. Martha sat by the window. Grace nestled against her chest in a sling made from Joseph's old shirt. She hummed hymns while watching him work, her voice carrying across the clearing. The baby grew plump and strong, her eyes tracking sunlight that danced across the cabin's wooden floor. "This wall'll hold against any slide now," Joseph said, fitting another sturdy log into place. His muscles ached, but pride warmed his chest as he surveyed his work. The cabin was becoming something new, not just shelter, but a true home. In the valley below, wild iris pushed through the thawing ground, painting the slopes in splashes of purple and white. Joseph spotted them while checking his trap lines, and that evening he brought Martha a handful. She arranged them in his wife's old tin cup, setting them on the table where they shared their evening meals. Trading day came with the full thaw. Joseph loaded his winter furs onto the mule, promising to return before sunset. In town, he got a fair price, enough for flour, coffee, and even a length of calico that made Martha's eyes shine. The shopkeeper's wife asked after the miracle baby, and for once, Joseph didn't mind the questions. He spoke of Grace with quiet joy. Each night, they gathered around the table, heads bowed over steaming bowls. Martha led their prayers, her voice strong and sure. Joseph's amen grew less hesitant with each passing day. Sometimes he caught himself humming hymns while he worked, songs he thought he'd forgotten. Word spread through the scattered homesteads about the Sunday services in Joseph's cabin. First came 2 families from down the valley, then others. Martha baked bread, and they shared scripture from Amos's old Bible. Joseph surprised himself by speaking about faith, halting words at first, then flowing easier, like spring melt finding its path. The circuit preacher arrived on a warm Sunday in late April, his horse lathered from the climb. He found 20 people gathered in and around the cabin, singing hymns that echoed off the mountainside. Joseph and Martha stood before him, Grace sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms as he pronounced them husband and wife. That evening, as twilight painted the peaks in soft purple, Joseph stood on the porch with his family. The air smelled of pine smoke and spring earth. Martha leaned against him, Grace's warm weight between them. "I hunted for meat that winter night," he whispered, his voice rough with gratitude. "The Lord sent me bread instead." Laughter drifted from the cabin, their home, where the remains of the wedding supper waited. Smoke curled from the chimney like a prayer. Above them, the first stars appeared, bright as promise, while the last snow melted from the mountain's shoulders. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heart lines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.